Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Replatform podcast. It's just me today, as James was unavailable, but I'm joined by Alex O'Brien, who is the co-founder of We Make Websites, and someone that I've known for many years through ecom generally, and back in the day, the London kind of ecom and Shopify community. About 6 months ago, we had Piers, Alex's co-founder, on, and he's been on before as well, and I think he's got the top 2 episode slots for number of listens. So it'd be interesting to see if you can beat him or compete with him.
No pressure.
Yeah. And today Alex is going to talk about, or we're going to have a discussion around Shopify Components and what that means for Shopify and the industry and, agencies like We Make Websites, the general direction of travel of Shopify. And then lastly, a bit about Web3, which Alex has some very strong and controversial views on. So to start off with, Alex, can you give us a bit of an intro on kind of your background, your role at We Make Websites as well?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name's Alex, and I'm co-founder, as Paul said, at We Make Websites. So we're one of the big Shopify agencies. So the bigger brands on Shopify, so mid-market and enterprise, those are the builds that we do: design, build, optimize. Most of our clients are in the US and UK, a few in Europe as well. And our team is spread around North America and UK. And we've been going over 10 years, and now we're part of a bigger group called Bond Group, so no longer independent. My interest in Shopify comes from I'm a developer by background, and as I think a lot of the Shopify agencies began as like developers and designers that were passionate about what they did and ended up growing into something bigger, and that's what happened to us as well.
Right. And so the first question, so as I mentioned earlier, Shopify Components is going to be a big topic for this discussion. And I guess, there's a lot of different views around the industry around what Shopify Components might mean for other platforms, and, kind of, I guess, like differing views around it being more of a marketing push versus like the true direction of the platform. What's your view on it, and how do you feel that it will be used in practice in years to come?
So, like you, I was in New York for NRF and the big sort of splash that was this announcement with, cover of the Wall Street Journal and lots of big events and so on. I do think it's important to say first that everyone seems a bit confused about what exactly it is. And I think that is because it is really a marketing play, which isn't to say that's a bad thing. I think it's much needed. But if you go through, they've sent a few sort of decks and briefings around it. And the basic idea is they want to enter the composable space with a bit more aggression. So they've, obviously Commerce Components is in the name. But if you look at the list of components, it's headless SDK, it's order management, payments platform, product catalog, B2B, customer data subscription. So all stuff it does already, but broken out into separate APIs, which I do think does have an appeal. And one of the events I was at had, Accenture there and Deloitte Digital and those type of like enterprisey consultancies. So I think it's smart, and it actually solves a big problem for us, which is when we pitch big brands back in the day in New York, we would go and get the subway and you'd see an ad for, Shopify, which was like talking about, hey, get started on Shopify with your first sock business or whatever, right? Which is not the messaging that you want when you're talking to like $100 million brand. So I think it helps us there to have a separate position in the market. So technically, I don't think there's a great deal to take in. They've lifted a lot of API limits and things like that. They've also added this professional services team, which is interesting. So they are basically human beings you can talk to if you pay enough that will make things possible on Shopify, which is helpful because often when you're talking to enterprise brands, they are a little less willing to bend their requirements to what Shopify does, which can be a barrier to adoption. So I think if there's those people that are able to make little tweaks and so on for them, then that's going to make a big difference. So I think that's quite welcome. Again, we don't know how it works yet, and we are, pestering our partner manager to find out what exactly this looks like. But good on them for announcing it. I do think it's going to help. And was that your read of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you, I think I'm intrigued by it more than anything else. I think it's a really good move. I think the interesting thing, and this kind of eats into the next question a little bit, but there's a bit of a battle between Shopify and Commercetools in my view. And I think, both of them probably wouldn't admit it, but, the high end of Shopify, Commercetools is a bit of a brand. The whole Mac piece is talked about by certain people, and again, very like present, very marketing orientated. But I think there's like a risk for Shopify that platforms like Commercetools, and maybe particularly Commercetools, because there's so much hype around them and there's so much association with enterprise and scaling tech, it feels like they could start chipping away at some of those brands. And you hear rumors that certain brands are going to move to Commercetools, but I think it's probably in a lot of cases for the wrong reasons. So I think Shopify needed to do this to essentially just have positioning that prevents CTOs and incoming CTOs and head of engineering and whatever else thinking that they need to invest everything in microservices orientated platforms. So yeah, that's kind of my view on it. I think it's a good move. I think they're probably it's probably been moving in this direction anyway, but I think they had to bring something to market. So I guess the next question, so I've got a bit of a sub question actually, like in terms of like you guys do a lot of headless, you were pretty early to it. Like, are your team excited by this? Do you think like from what you do know already, like is there like, do you think it will give you more freedom, more flexibility? Like, will it solve problems?
So my relationship with composable, headless, API first, whatever you want to call it, is complicated. So I think that there is flexibility there, but I've been doing this long enough to remember pre-monolithic days when you had to worry about caching rates and connecting APIs and data freshness and all this stuff, which thankfully was basically commodified and eliminated when you got these huge platforms like Shopify and Squarespace and everybody else at WordPress and Drupal that were all monolithic, which has become a bit of a negative word, but I think it's a great thing. It means a front-end developer doesn't need to know anything about data structures and caches and all that kind of stuff. And we're kind of throwing that away with the rather abstract notion of flexibility and adaptability. So, and I have invested in these companies, and I'm a fan of when they work, and we've built headless sites that I'm very proud of. So I'm not against it by any stretch, but the use case, the analogy I always use is it's like building your own house instead of moving into one. Like it is definitely, if you can, if you need to do it, and if you have the expertise to do it, and if you can afford it, then that's great, and you might get a lot out of it. But most people are fine moving into a house that already exists, and they get a lot of benefit out of that. So that's the analogy. I think Shopify's response to it. So about 5 years ago, when this hype was starting to happen, I saw Toby talking about it, and he said, "We've had a storefront API for 10 years." So this must have been 2018, yeah, for 10 years, and therefore we're headless. And it felt a little bit defensive, And I think the reality is, first of all, that API isn't very good and doesn't give you a lot of features of Shopify which are powerful, like checkout gating and queuing. If you've got huge amounts of traffic, anti-bot detection, and some of the really fancy features of Shopify you don't get. So it was almost like they were kind of trying to put you off doing it. And I think there's been enough, money gone into headless from the VC world to make the hype a little bit real. And so Shopify finally bent to that kind of hype and come up with this, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think in the non-zero rate interest era, it'll be interesting how many brands actually care about trying to do something novel with their architecture and actually just want to go back to a store that just works. So that's the feeling I get. The team's excited. I mean, new tech's always interesting. I think as an agency, it's always interesting and normally quite profitable to do new stuff. So that's good. Whether or not it's suitable for most brands, I think that's a bigger, harder question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've got pretty similar views to you. And, as a consultancy, we see quite a lot of failed or either failed headless projects or failed, truly composable projects where people essentially invest a lot of money and then end up going back to a Shopify or a BigCommerce or, more simple, fast product. And I think the other thing is those that don't necessarily do that, there's a lot of regret often as well. And there's a lot of brands with non-technical teams that just slow down their progress through their roadmap and can't trade the site as effectively, etc. And I think it just just changes what people are able to work on. So I think there's pros and cons to it, and it's just I think with so like particularly, you know, Mac and, you know, all the platforms, like there's just so much marketing and bias, and yeah, that's my only thing that I have against the movement. But I think, you know, there's places where or times where it makes sense, times where it doesn't make sense.
I think one thing that I've come to conclude is that most brands, e-commerce brands, should not be tech companies and probably shouldn't have a CTO, or not a full-time CTO anyway. And so, you know, there are cases where that's true, but I think a good flagship example of that is Glossier, which, you know, built their own platform for years, and now they've just moved to Shopify. And I just think an e-com brand, its competency is obviously product and brand and positioning, and maybe a bit of sort of supply chain as well. And two, data. So having first-party data on customers and therefore getting high lifetime value out of that. It's not really being a technology company. And I think with these more complicated stacks, you risk getting into that territory. Now, if you're like a massive multi-brand retailer, then maybe there's a bit more justification for it. But for most of the brands we work with that are more like a brand selling online rather than a retailer or like multi-brand, there's not that many cases where you would go composable, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that.
Attract, your complete product discovery growth engine. Create relevant shopping experiences that convert into sales and grow online revenue with personalized search, merchandising, and recommendation solutions powered by AI. Find out more at attract.com.
Next question. So when we were in New York, I know you went to a few kind of events and meetups with senior Shopify people. So staying on the theme of components, do you have a view of how they might price it? So I guess my assumption was it might be more order based or, you know, API based. Do you have a view around?
So they say it's going to be usage based. That's another thing that we didn't get an answer to, and we are still asking. They said it's going to be more expensive than Plus, which is funny because you're kind of getting less, right? Theoretically. So I don't know exactly how that's going to work. So we don't know. And as soon as we know, we'll get that out. But it seems like, you know, and I don't think this is a bad thing necessarily, but it seems like they were just ready to roll with this announcement, decided to go ahead anyway, but hadn't quite finalized what they're actually doing, which I don't think that's bad. Like, I'm glad that they're hustling a little bit and shipping stuff. So I don't know. But no, we don't know what it costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question. So you've obviously been in the Shopify space for a long time, probably the longest of anyone I know. And, you know, the whole space has changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And recently we've been doing a bit more in the US where it feels like, you know, it's particularly going crazy. And, you know, so many brands are moving over now from like the enterprise or, you know, the enterprise essentially. What's your view on the ecosystem and kind of where Shopify is going this year? What's your view on kind of Shopify?
So that trend is interesting because obviously an economic downturn isn't great in most situations, and everybody's feeling the pain a bit. But an interesting thing is you do get enterprise brands that start saying, hang on a minute, why are we spending so much on, you know, Commerce Cloud or Magento? And maybe they start looking at Shopify. So you get a speeding up of the movement of enterprise and Shopify. So we're seeing a bit of that. Obviously, everyone's watching their budgets, and that means maybe replatforms that would have happened might not happen. It means clients that are on retainer are looking for more justification or more value in what they're doing, which is good. They should always be asking that, but it seems a little bit more pertinent now, and we're getting pushed a bit more on, like, you know, what have you guys actually done, shipped this month, which is good. And like, I think, like I say, zero interest rates meant that we all got a little bit free and easy with like how we spent time and how we spent money and everything. And I think it's kind of good that everybody's tightening up a little bit. So agencies are going to have to show value in a way that they probably didn't have to in the sort of COVID era when we were all just sort of riding the gravy train. Consolidations happened a lot. So obviously when we started off the Shopify ecosystem, one of the things that's great about it, like I said, is there's a lot of designers, developers, basically a bunch of weirdos running companies that are lovely people. And we were all very friendly from the beginning and kind of grew up together. Now you're getting consolidation. So you had Accenture acquiring the Stable, which included BVA, which was one of like the big independent Shopify agency from the beginning. Most of our competition have joined large groups. We've joined Born and TechM. And I think that was always coming. And a question for us was, do we start buying companies or do we join a bigger group? In the end, we joined a bigger group. So I think you'll see more of that. And I think that's interesting. That's a good thing. It's a sign of maturity for our ecosystem, I think. So I don't think things are slowing down. And anecdotally, I get asked a lot about, Shopify's future and trends there. And anecdotally, it's not slowing down, right? It's like the brands we see coming in the door, and I'm sure it's the same for you. The brands we see coming through the door are bigger and better than ever. There isn't an alternative really. And I know, like you say, Commercetools is, punching upwards a little bit. For a bit, BigCommerce seemed to be doing okay, and that seems to have gone off the boil a little bit now. But it doesn't seem like really there's a strong competitor at the minute.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the point that you made around, brands moving from Salesforce in particular at the moment is definitely something we've seen. I think the smaller brands that, don't have ridiculously high OpEx costs and don't have like a real need to re-platform, are, holding off, like you say. But I think one thing that we've definitely seen is even more complex businesses moving from the SAPs, the Salesforces, are like getting CapExes signed off because the OpEx cost is just ridiculous. So I think that'll be continued trends this year. It feels like there's less projects around, but the ones that are happening for the likes of you guys are definitely bigger. That's like what I've seen. Yeah. So next question. So I get, it's kind of a very similar question. So that's kind of the ecosystem, but what about kind of changes to Shopify Plus in particular? Like what kind of newness do you think we'll see this year? Where do you think we'll see them kind of investing development resources? Obviously, like the big one that I think has improved a lot over the last couple of years, but still needs more work is the international side. Like, do you think they'll finally start to kind of nail some of that? Like, what do you expect them to release some work on this?
Yeah. I hope so. You're right. That the international piece I never quite got right. And that's always been our thing. So we started off in the UK and Europe. So every brand basically sells in different languages and currencies. And it's less common in the US because you can be so big in US dollars and in English only. So we've always done international Shopify, and you've always had to kind of work around or get it to work a certain way. It seems like they're getting there. So we just launched Markets Pro, which seems a bit more flexible and finally works the way that a proper brand would work in terms of international. Because their first rollout was like this kind of big tech kind of hubris where it's like, we'll just build something that we think, is the way people should run an international business. But, if you're already an established retailer selling into several countries, then you're not going to change how you do pricing strategy or whatever to use a percentage or use a spot FX rate. So all that stuff, it took them a long time to get around to. It always felt like multilingual was like, it was always bolted onto core a little bit. And I think they're getting closer now to making that a part of the core architecture, which is good. When I was in New York, I saw an interesting talk by Glenn Coates, who is VP of product. He was actually the founder of Handshake, which they acquired like 2 or 3 years ago. So they put him in VP of product position, which I think is good because he's a hustler, he's a founder, he's clearly very knowledgeable about e-commerce, computer science background. So, the real deal. And he explained 6 principles of product at Shopify, which I thought were interesting. So Shopify's fast, always available and great was the first one. And he had a good quote, which I agree with. I think it comes from Toby. There is no good software that is not fast, which is such a good quote. So that was their first principle. Shopify converts better and makes more money. Second one. Third, Shopify keeps my business cutting edge. 4th, Shopify scales from hello world to global empire. 5, Shopify is perfect for the web. 6, best app ecosystem and developer experience. So those are my notes on it. And that's a good set of principles. It does seem like they're going back to basics a little bit in terms of it almost became a running joke that stuff got announced at Unite and then wasn't announced until the next, even the one after, right? You'd be waiting 2 years sometimes for stuff to be released. And I think, again, 0 interest rate era, loss of hiring, loss of expansion. And we were all, in whatever way, we were all making the most of that. But now things are getting a bit more lean, right? And we're having to go back to, hey, what actually works here and what's important. So I think there's a very long way of answering your question. I think this year you'll see them shipping a lot more and shipping stuff that's actually useful and that we're asking for. And things like this Commerce Components announcement is a little bit of like bending to the real world, like bending to what are people asking for, and let's just give them it. So hopefully it should be a good year for agencies and partners, and they'll be announcing stuff that we can please clients with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I had another question that I think we've kind of covered around, demand for around replatforming Shopify essentially. So I changed it to be more B2B focused. So obviously they released the kind of new B2B offering late last year. Have you seen much demand around it? Like, do you see a lot of big brands, or like not necessarily even big brands, but do you see a lot of genuine kind of B2B businesses moving to Shopify or scoping Shopify out?
Not as many as I'd like. So what we tend to get is big businesses that have a B2B operation and they're still doing it in, with these spreadsheets or something. And we help them like get it onto Shopify, but we normally build them a second store that we build around wholesale. So, it's got a password protection on it. Maybe it's got like a table of prices instead of, you see the full SKU matrix for like a product. You might have a checkout that includes purchase order rather than credit card payments, that type of thing, which normally gets the job done. Shopify have had like 2 or 3 iterations at doing a B2B product, and none of them, again, they're like international, none of them have quite done what people actually, the way people actually run these parts of their businesses. So I think they get in there, and I think they will get there, but we still take that other route of, and plus you get 10 stores anywhere in the price. So we just use one of those as a B2B store. It gives them a bit more flexibility, and often design-wise, there's things they want to do differently as well, or they might have weird requirements like, you can only buy in blocks of 8 or 12 or whatever. So we can build all that stuff in on the front end.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've played around with it a bit, and I think there's a good core there for them to build on. I think the other thing that obviously it's built for B2B, but having price lists within the core of Shopify, I'm hoping will enable them to build out more functionality around that and kind of, the Magento style kind of customer groups, and allow for more like handling of multiple price lists essentially, and proper discounting as well. So it'd be interesting to see how that progresses. So I guess the obvious topic for me to talk about having you on the podcast is Web3, and I think you were very keen to touch on it. And you've had, you've posted a lot on LinkedIn about it, and I know you've wrote a lot of pretty controversial blog posts over the last couple of years on kind of the true value proposition of Web3. So what's your view now? You've been a cynic for a while. Like, has it changed? Like, do you see any genuine kind of e-com use cases, and do you see that changing over the next year or two?
No. So I'll give you my Web3 spiel. And I think the hype has died off a little bit, but hopefully we can kill it dead. So first of all, Web3 it's a loose term. It's basically anything that uses a blockchain, and there's always a bit of hand waving around this concept about what exactly it is, but that's the gist of it. So I have a few problems with it. So the first one is the technology. So the technology is terrible. Technology in general always makes things faster, cheaper, and better. And in Web3, it doesn't do that. It makes things more complicated. So you and I have worked in a world of e-com where you have a one-click checkout, payment is instant, you're protected against fraud, you don't have to look after your own money, and so on. And this is a world where none of that stuff exists. You've got like multiple steps on a wallet to try and connect. You always feel like you're being phished, even if you are computer literate, you feel like you're being phished all the time. And, something like the Bitcoin, just to choose an example, and, every time I criticize one of these things, people say, well, Bitcoin isn't crypto and crypto isn't Web3, whatever. It's what they call a no true Scotsman fallacy. Whatever you critique, they'll say, oh, well, that's not the thing. But let's just use Bitcoin as an example. So Bitcoin does about 7 transactions a second. It will never get faster because the algorithm is anti-efficient. So Satoshi's original algorithm 15 years ago, you could mine a coin on a normal laptop from 2008, and you can't do that anymore. You need data centers to do that, so it's intentionally anti-efficient. Meanwhile, Visa, MasterCard, hate to say it, but great innovators in tech, and they're doing maybe 50,000 transactions a second. So it seems odd to go from a world like that to a world where things are slow. And I do think there's a lot of press around energy usage, and the energy usage of Bitcoin being more than most countries, but something that doesn't get enough airtime is the hardware destruction. So today, the amortized cost of one Bitcoin transaction in hardware is 2 iPhones. So every time you send a Bitcoin transaction, imagine throwing your iPhone in the bin and then another one. That's the amount of hardware that's used to do that. And it's just a horrendous use of computing power. Obviously, we've seen that GPUs have been able to, in the last couple of months with AI, do actually useful things, like immediately we can see. So all that GPU power could be used for something else. And it's just it's so painful to see an anti-efficient algorithm like that. The other thing, that's crypto in general, that technologically it makes no sense. It's hard to use or whatever. NFTs I can get into, but NFTs have got many of the same problems. So the protocol itself points to a digital asset that is normally hosted on a file server somewhere. So there's no protection against the asset. NFTs, you don't normally store the asset on the Ethereum chain. So because the Ethereum chain is too hard and expensive to use, so no one does that. And if you know anything about the history of technology, you'll know that taking upon on a platform being the one that's around in 10 years is generally a bad idea. So if you think about Netscape or MySpace or even Facebook nowadays, these are the platforms that tend to die off eventually, and someone else replaces them. So it's absolutely bananas that we would make a bet that Ethereum is the internet next. Nice little fact about the Ethereum main chain. So a Raspberry Pi, the little computer that kids use, I think that's capable of around 3 million ads a second, which is about 5,000 times more efficient than the Ethereum virtual computer, right? So we've gone from a world of basically post-scarcity computing power where you and I can do anything we want with streaming and the internet and gaming and whatever it is, to a world of artificial limit. So that's the technology. Second problem is the politics of it, which has got this kind of ugly techno libertarianism or cyber libertarianism, which is this idea that basically all post-Renaissance thinking is bad and institutions are bad, centralization is bad. Normally sort of grievance orientated men, making these comments about it. And it's a bit like talking to a 16-year-old about politics, and a lot of these guys have not read books. So SBF famously didn't read any books. And you can tell, right? When you talk to them about the history of ideas or political organizing or whatever. So immature political appreciation, and all money is political. So it is important. Final one is the economics of it all. So any coin, including Bitcoin, the only future cash flow comes from someone else buying the coin, right? It's not like buying a stock of even a poorly performing company that in theory is doing something useful and receiving revenue from customers for that. And that's where you get returns in the long run. There is nothing except a greater fool buying the coin later, which is a Ponzi scheme. And this whole thing, this is the reason it's going in the toilet at the minute, right? When people don't have the money and the dream dies, it collapses. And there's a great deal of resilience in that, and I'm sure that there'll be waves of Bitcoin, and it will always have a use in either illegal uses or just gambling. I don't think gambling should be illegal, so fine. But as some kind of revolutionary technology, I'm not so optimistic.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I think a lot of people seem to be kind of moving more towards that view, at least around kind of some of the more mainstream aspects of it. So sub question again, so Shopify, obviously, at the heart of your business and your career for the last 10 plus years, have invested a lot of time and energy in Web3, and at various points, it's been a big focus for them. Do you think this will continue, or do you think this was just, I guess, their opportunity to kind of capitalize around hype and demand?
I think a lot of founders and VCs that made it in Web 2 felt like this was going to feel like that again, right? Like they wanted to believe, and I think Andreessen Horowitz is the biggest criminal in this regard, that they wanted to feel like, hey, this is like the 90s again, or the 2000s, and we're early and it's so exciting and we're revolutionizing everything. But like I just said, there was no underlying pinning to what they were trying to do. And maybe the same happened at Shopify. I mean, I don't know. I think, Toby's a developer, and I think as a developer, it's nice to think that we might be changing the world somehow. I don't know. I think the other thing is Shopify deals with a lot of hype brands, that probably could use NFT. I mean, NFT at the end of the day is a Veblen good, which is a good that the amount you pay for how little it actually is worth is the status. Like when you buy a handbag from like a luxury brand, it doesn't cost that much to make, but you're buying it for the status value, which is what an NFT is. And okay, maybe there's some streetwear brands that will do it. Whether or not they should have put that many developers onto it at a time when their share price was collapsing, is, I think, a good question. I don't think I would have done that. So not too optimistic. I think once the hype dies off, hopefully they can disband that team or at least focus on doing something useful. I got a good story about e-commerce NFTs. So Starbucks finally launched their NFT thing at the end of last year, which had the aura of a corporate initiative that had rumbled through from the hype point of 2021 crypto and finally got around to being released embarrassingly a year later when everybody kind of realized that all this stuff was, worth very little, let's say. So they announced this NFT release on Starbucks, and a lot of people felt like it was like, giving CPR to Web3. But a lot of people don't know the same day they announced the new measures against unionized Starbucks. So if you are a Starbucks that unionizes, you don't get access to the same benefits, which is obviously not great PR. So my hot take is they announced NFTs on the same day, so they would get the hype that would cover the story about anti-unionization, and therefore that is the only documented use of an NFT.
That makes sense. And interesting use of that. So last question, and sticking on Web3, are there, and I guess you have already touched on this a little bit, but are there any kind of positive use cases of anything kind of within Web3 or blockchain that you think are relevant to e-commerce businesses and brands?
No. So Web3 is a justification to find a use for the blockchain. But the problem is the blockchain is normally an inferior way of implementing something, right? So one I hear quite a lot is, a luxury brand like, one of the LVMH brands could use blockchain to like trace the provenance of their clothes, right, in the secondary market. But why would a party that trusts itself do that, right? You could just do that in a MySQL database, right? Way easier and way more reliably and without wasting so much money and computing power. So there are very few, there's no applications where not using a blockchain when using a blockchain is preferable. And the two big, another CPR moment with Web3 was the Australian Stock Exchange claiming they were going to move to blockchain, and Maersk, the global shipping company, attempting a blockchain project, both of which were discontinued at the end of last year because it doesn't work. And you may as well build the same thing with a database. So, no, probably not. I'm also quite a big fan of deletion, as in the concept of deleting things, which if you want a definition of blockchain, it is an append-only database, and they've been around since about 1979. Merkle tree was the first implementation, and Satoshi's blockchain was just a different type, a sort of trustless version. But deletion is quite a helpful concept. So in banking, there's plenty of times we reverse transactions when things have gone wrong. If you want to think about blockchain applications for things like social media, imagine an uncensorable social media where doxing, child pornography or whatever could be put on the chain and never removed. The moment these ideas hit reality, there's all sorts of flaws that mean that they should never be implemented. The big one that comes up a lot is security. $12 billion lost so far on hacks just by having the wrong key or giving your key away or whatever. And I think the underlying thing there that's interesting is many of the features of Web3 are not desirable for normal people or most people, right? So it's a bit like someone saying, hey, everybody could host their own web server if they wanted to host their own website, right? Which is what people used to say in the 90s. And of course, no one wants to do that. Even if you know how to do that, you don't want to do that. You'd rather just pay someone else to deal with it and not think about it. And there's a great deal of efficiency that comes with centralization. It comes with like us having institutions and businesses that thrive on one thing. So Not optimistic, and hopefully it's going to pass. I think AI is going to do it because a lot of these insufferable people that just follow the latest trends, they'll move on to AI, and I do think there is more legs in AI. I mean, in the last 2 months, we've seen more applications of AI than we've seen from blockchain in 15 years. So I think once the talent goes, and I'll end the question on this note, once the talent goes on something else, that will be a good day, because one of the saddest things about this whole debacle is the amount of talent and money that has gone on this like fool's errand of Web3, when we could have been building real stuff, real technology that makes businesses better, faster, operate in a more efficient way, create real jobs, create real value. And instead it's almost like a performance art moment where we've taken the worst excesses of capitalism and the world we live in and tried to do it even faster on Web3. So not optimistic.
I think that's always super interesting hearing your views on this stuff. And I think I guess my last kind of closing point or question to you is going to be, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it? But I think in addition to that, you've got a blog, right, that was originally like a bit of an alter ego, and then now some really good stuff on it. What's the address of that?
It's Web2Boomer, web2boomer.com. So I slowed down writing on it when it all collapsed, or when FTX collapsed. I kind of felt like I've had enough of this stuff, and I kind of felt like my own time was being wasted on articulating this stuff a little bit. I think I'll write about it again, because I do think there's a lot of interesting lessons from it, and I think anthropologically it's interesting how people have behaved, and the gold rush that was the good old days, and the criticisms of the technology are all quite interesting. So I'll probably continue, but I'm also keen to keep writing about things that are going to help people more. So, if I'm in a position of being like a bro that is being thinking I can just buy a shitcoin and kind of go to the moon, I want to reach those people and say, hey, you can actually make a good living in tech by building real value, which is something that we've both done. So keen to get that message out. So I'm going to be writing more about that this year. So hopefully that's an optimistic note.
Great. I would recommend checking that out. There's some really good content on there. And then if people do want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so? So
I'm on Twitter, Web2Boomer. My email is alex@aob.io. Always willing to, well, not always willing, sometimes willing to chat to people. Reach out, check out the blog, Web2Boomer. And sorry if you can hear drilling in the background. That's my jacuzzi getting fixed.
Wow, living the dream over there in Miami. Lovely. So thanks everyone for listening and tuning in. As always, if you're listening on YouTube, give us a like, follow us. James usually does this closing bit, so I can't remember the other bits he says, but thanks for listening, and thanks for joining.
Follow, subscribe.
That's it. It's all of those things. Lovely. Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.